I am David Tenenhouse. It's great to be here for this section on research models and research funding. Especially great just to be here with ISI celebrating this anniversary. I've known so many great folks at ISI, going all the way to Keith Unkefer, who was a great mentor and advisor to me when I was at DARPA. John Putsdale, Danny Cohen, so many other great folks over the years. I do have to have a little personal disclaimer. Some of you may know that I'm currently working part-time as an intermittent expert for the National Science Foundation, helping to launch the TIP Directorate. But I'm here today speaking for myself. So, everything you hear today is kind of my own personal views, not those of the NSF. So with that in mind, we've got three great speakers to kick us off and then join us in the discussion. Jeanette Wang from Columbia, Oren Etzioni from the Allen Institute for AI, and Moshe Vardi from Rice. And I'm just going to turn it over to Jeanette to get us started.
Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I also have a little ISI story. I spent a summer there. I was actually lucky to be in Ralph London's office on the 12th floor and had a beautiful view of the marina. And then, of course, I was at USC for 2 years on the faculty. So I do have fond memories of Los Angeles. Today, I'm going to talk, and I'm going to now share my screen. I have only 4 slides, not including this one, and I want to talk about, well, new models for research, not just computing research. My first slide asks the question, what is the purpose of higher education? What is the purpose of academia? What should we look like in 50 years? This is a very, very timely topic that many universities are facing right now, given a lot of changes in social norms and economic and political tension and so on. What we have been talking about a lot at Columbia University is what we call the 4th purpose. So the first 3 purposes of higher education, just to remind everyone in the audience, is education, research, and service. And the current discussion about a 4th purpose really can best be captured in terms of the phrase transforming knowledge to action. And this is where we address societal problems. We engage with non-traditional partners outside of academia, including industry, non-government organizations, government labs, and so on. And the idea is, why can't we be like a medical school where you have research to clinical practice, but have the whole university be that way? And for computer science and engineering in general, this is actually quite inherent to what we do, because we often tackle real-world problems with generalizable solutions. We often take our scholarly research and try to apply it to the real world. So at Columbia University, we're taking this quite seriously. It's a presidential initiative. There's a whole effort called Columbia World Projects. We have an Obama Scholars Program, and we even have a new vice provost for 4th purpose. So that's point number 1. The bigger question, what is the purpose of academia? Point number 2 is to put this in the context of DC, the national or the US mood. And it's not perhaps coincidental that if you see what's happening in DC, I like to call it 4th purpose in DC. As David mentioned, this new Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate, in some sense, is all about 4th purpose. And it's really nice to see the National Science Foundation and Congress and White House actually being quite supportive of encouraging a new kind of research set of partnerships, a new kind of transformation of action to from knowledge to action. And the other activities going on, the recent passing of the CHIPS and Science Act, Inflation Reduction Act, and even the new OMB memo for R&D FY24 priorities, all really point to the same theme of, I would say, use-inspired research, the missing millions, improved and increased attention to STEM and diversity in all fields. And for computer science, of course, all of the implications are that these are fantastic opportunities. And it's kind of, we're very lucky to be in where we are because we can take advantage of these opportunities. Well, the last point I'd like to make on this is, of course, it's not a done deal. Chips and so on are authorizations, they're not appropriations. And so, of course, we still need to rally the troops to make sure that the budgets get approved accordingly. So those are 2 points I wanted to make. Let me turn to a different topic, which is one of my favorite topics. It's a vision that I have. I don't think I'm going to realize this vision in my lifetime, but it's a vision anyway. I call it the academic cloud. And this really does depend on academia, industry, and government partnerships. And the whole idea is to scale up computing research and make it available to all universities and colleges. And it's not just for research, but it's for education as well. And it's not just for computer science and not just for AI, it's for all disciplines. And it's not even just for STEM, it really is for all disciplines. And the idea is that, well, there are many reasons for this. First of all, cutting edge AI is happening in industry. They have the data, they have the compute. Academia is kind of left in the dust. The other motivation is, of course, on-prem scientific computing is reaching its limits in terms of cooling and power. And so we need to push into the cloud. And there are a lot of other growing data needs, both internal and external constraints. And, you know, commercial cloud providers stand up government clouds. Why not one for academia? I kind of view this as big as the internet, except it's like a cloud net or an academic cloud. And I do think that the government is taking good baby steps, like the National AI Resource Repository is a good baby step, but $1 billion is hardly enough to really support the kind of research that's done in the cloud. And I want to close my 10 minutes with one final slide, one final point, which I know Oren is going to elaborate on in more detail. And that is new models of academia industry partnerships. Of course, we have individual to individual level partnerships already, but I think we need to be more creative in the way in which academia lets faculty collaborate with industry, perhaps have an appointment in industry, and you know, it's about evaluation and tenure and appointments, and I think universities have to be a little more flexible. One idea that I think Amazon has really proven successful is their Amazon Scholars Program, where the company buys 20% of faculty time. So that's at the individual level. At the institutional level, of course, there are tried and true ways, internships, fellowships, and so on. And there's my favorite model, the Intel Lablet model, which David Tenenhouse is, of course, famous for, which was super for those universities that were housing Intel Lablets, but perhaps not so equitable across academia in general. So I do think now is the time for academia and industry to explore new kinds of partnerships, especially given the new National Science Foundation Directorate tip. And I think we need to be thinking about sustaining these partnerships for the long term. Think 5 years at least, not 3 years, to avoid the constant renegotiation with lawyers. And I think these kinds of pop-up centers that appear at universities, they're funded for a couple of years and then they go away, the funding goes away, so the center goes away, so the partnership goes away. That's not really good enough. There's too much uncertainty for academia. which really is all about looking at the long term to support our students and so on. Of course, there are challenges like conflicts of interest, conflicts of commitment, equity challenges, and so on. So I'll stop there now, and I know Moshe and Oren will follow up with more details on these points. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeanette. That was great.
That
Oren,
was 10
over to you.
minutes.
Okay, let's see if I can successfully share my screen in this setup. Not sure that I can. Let's do this, share. Okay, and let's go here and do that. Okay, I assume you can see my slides. So yeah, thanks, Jeanette. It was really terrific. And as you said, I'm going to go into a lot more detail about one of your points based on our experience at AI2 and elsewhere. But let me start here by saying, you know, there are certain topics that we don't tend to discuss in polite society, and certainly not at an academic conference. So one of them is politics, although that's on our minds with the upcoming election. Another one is sex, and I'm not going to have a lot to say about that, sorry. But the third one is money, and I will say something about that topic today. And money is a challenge for academia. My colleague Ali Farhadi, computer vision expert, UW professor, said this very well about seeing major players in the industry making insane offers to academics. Ali is now at Apple, so obviously he didn't just say this, but he was swept up by it. And more generally, my colleagues have been talking about how this brain drain from academia, eating our seed corn. I've talked about killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. Ed Lazowska talked about the tragedy of the commons. And so it really is a problem. And to give a very concrete illustration, here are some of the top faculty at Stanford. I think you probably know all of them, or at least most of them. And Stanford, as Jeanette alluded to, right, has had a somewhat inflexible policy in terms of people's relationship with industry, leaves of absence, and as a result, Andrew Ng is gone. He's not at Stanford, or at least he has an adjunct appointment, but he's not a full faculty member. Sebastian Thrun, Daphne Kohler, Mark Lavoie, Bill Daly, gone. Now there's plenty of other talented people there, but it is very much an issue. So how do we address this problem? There's, of course, multiple solutions. We want to increase the supply of people. We want to engage more women, more minorities. We need to do better with immigration, particularly of students and faculty. We also need to improve conditions in academia. I've spent the last 9 years heading AI2, the Nonprofit Research Institute. And I have to say that I look back at endless committee meetings and writing proposals over and over again, just with, I just shudder. I can't believe I did that for 20 something years. We can do better in academia. But the point that I really want to focus on is the idea of increasing flexibility for professors, maybe even for students, by allowing them to engage in startups and to have joint appointments. And a huge reason here is because of the massive difference in compensation, frankly, between universities and industry, right? The supply-demand mismatch of experts really cause this problem. And of course, startups are a good thing. They create jobs, they help bring things to the marketplace. So I just listed here some startups started by professors. Several of them are, billion-dollar plus companies, incredibly successful. We need to see, I would say, more of that, not less. The other point to remember is that the brain drain issue isn't just about money. It's also about data and computational resources. So if we think about this idea that Jeanette talked about of joint appointments with industry, the pros go beyond compensation. There's data, there's compute, there's a better perspective. I took a leave of absence, some decades ago. Spent a year as a CTO of a public company, and when I came back, I was able to introduce a new course based on my experience that the undergrads really loved. So there's a lot of positives here beyond greed. There are, of course, cons. So there's conflicts of interest, potentially, the interest of the professor versus the students. There are IP issues we have to think about. But really, the biggest one is time. If you're spending, say, 50% of your time at Google, which some people have, or at Coursera, or what have you, then how do you have time for your academic commitments? And I'm reminded, actually, of that there was a Netflix show on Bill Gates. And it said, what is the one thing that Bill Gates needs? And the answer is time, right? We all have only 24 hours in the day. And so one special thing that we've done at AI2 is a little magic trick, which I call creating time. How does AI2 create time? Well, because we're a nonprofit, we eliminated IP barriers, and I think universities and companies could do a lot more of that. And then when people do research, they often do joint research. And of course, both affiliations appear on the paper. So here's a paper by Yijin Choi and her team, and you can see Allen AI and University of Washington affiliations. Here's another paper out of Bar Ilan. We have an office in Israel, and Yoav Goldberg and Ruud Sarfati are at Bar Ilan and also at AI2. So the point is, an important part of our jobs is to translate ideas, to do research, to translate them into papers, and then for the relevant institutions to receive appropriate credit. And by having joint credit, we do that. And my last slide, to keep this short, is that this approach to creating time is actually quite effective in enhancing people's productivity. So here's a before and after snapshot for a few of AI2's faculty members who are joint with the University of Washington. The dark blue is their productivity measured in papers, not the best measure, but a convenient one. Their productivity before they joined AI2 and their productivity afterwards. Clearly, this approach enables them to supercharge their research. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. Moshe, over to you to back cleanup.
Okay. So I'll take a somewhat, not quite opposing, but a different perspective on, especially on the industry-academia relationship. And my slogan would be, we thought we are the Rebel Alliance. Turns out that we are the empire. Let me explain what I mean by that. So I've been heavy involvement with ACM over the past several years. And over the past decade, ACM has three major celebrations. 2012, Turing Centenary, 2017, Turing Award, 50 years for the Turing Award, and just last June, ACM at 75. And when you look through the program, you see that 2012 was clear celebration of computing. 2017, celebration of computing. But the one just a couple of months ago, it was very different. Here is something that this is what they said. The panel will imagine what might be next for technology and society in the years to come. Suddenly we're talking about society. And in fact, a well-known computer scientist who participated in the event wrote on Facebook, I found the whole thing a little depressing because so much discussion of adverse impacts. But you cannot ignore what happened just before the ACM at 75. A day before, 2 weeks before that, there was the massacre in Uvalde, Texas. 21 kids and 19 kids and 2 teachers were killed. A day before the event, there was the first public congressional hearing about the January 6th insurrections. And I think we're all becoming very aware how polarized this country is. You look at the issue, for example, banning the sale of AR-15 style semi-automatic rifles among gun owners. Among Democrats, Democratic gun owners, 84% are in favor. Against Republican gun owners, 75% are against. Just looking at Trump, 92% of Democrats think that he threatened U.S. democracy. 76% of Republicans think he will exercise his right to contest the election. People are now writing about the disunited states of America, about how we get paralysis and democracy is in danger. And there are real worries about the coming midterm election that's coming in November. And a deep question is, what went wrong? What happened? And I'm sure historians will spend 50 years writing about this. But let me offer a somewhat glib answer. And it goes back to 1981. Pivotal event, September, I arrived at Stanford as a postdoc. But more significantly, about a month before that, the IBM PC was introduced. And at the beginning of the year, Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as US president. Three pivotal events, maybe not of the same significance. So the IBM PC led to a tsunami of technology. It went in such a fast pace. By the mid-80s, every knowledge worker has a computer on their desk. A few years later, they had it in their home. The web was introduced, internet commercial, Google, Facebook, iPhone, when just a tsunami of technology. But we cannot ignore that this happened concurrently with a tsunami of neoliberalism, which is Reagan launched in this country, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, which is this free market capitalism on steroids. Economic liberalization, reduction in government spending, privatization, deregulation, monetarism, tax reduction, globalization, free trade, and so on and so forth. And it will require a much finer analysis I can do here, but the outcome of these two things has been economic polarization. So this will happen if you look at a change in real weekly earning. Real means adjusting for inflation between 1963 and 2017 for people in working age, 18 to 64. And you see that if you're here at the top line, this is for people with graduate degrees, they've done very well. People with graduate degree, again, they've done better than inflation, women better than men. But people without bachelor education, especially men, have really lost ground, and women either maybe made a little progress or also lost ground. So we have real economic polarization in this country. But one of the things that happened under Reagan administration is the abolition of the fairness doctrine. The fairness doctrine said if you have a broadcast license, you're supposed to be balanced. So if you watch TV in the mid-70s, all three major channels basically had to be balanced. In 1987, the FCC said, oh, we have cable channel now. So we don't need this balance anymore, and you choose your own cable. But the answer is that people don't consume 5 different cable channels. They stick usually to one channel. And so what we've had, going back to 1987, is cognitive polarization. Just ask people, what channel do you watch? And that tells you a lot about their views of the world. And social media put it again on steroid, this filter bubble that were mentioned before. And I have the feeling now I'm reminded of a book that I read in the 80s. My son was a teenager. I tried to read his books, and this is called Ender's Game. And spoiler alert, Ender thinks he's playing a video game, but he's actually fighting intergalactic war. And when he wins the game, he really destroys a whole other civilization. And going back to our slogan, we thought we were the Rebel Alliance. Turns out we are the Empire. Now, there is some response to this. Is a code of ethics start. Computing professional action changed the world. To act responsibly, they should reflect on the wider impact of the world, consistently supporting the public good. So this, I think, is a great challenge for us. How do we ensure that our computing research consistently supports the public good? Well, it's a challenge. And the national academies rose to the challenge and they issued a report earlier this year, fostering responsible computing research, foundations, and practices. And here is just a paragraph from the executive summary. with computing technology increasingly woven into our society's infrastructure, it is vital for the computing research community to be able to address the ethical and societal challenges that can arise from the development of this technology, from the erosion of personal privacy to the spread of false information. But this leaves me deeply confused, because it seems to conflate research and development. Do the people who do research are responsible for how companies then develop the technology? Am I responsible for the loss of erosion of personal privacy and the spread of false information? And while the previous speaker talked about deeper connection between industry and academia and industry, I want to ask, are we on the same side now? Because I'm committed to the public good, and non-profits are committed to public good. I'm not so convinced that all companies are committed to the public good. Now, they have to make money. I understand it, they're businesses. But the question, are they balancing the business versus the public good or not? I'm not so convinced that this is true for all companies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Moshe. And, a little sobering, but in its own way still, inspiring in terms of the public good. So we've had some great opening remarks, and then, amazing that you all got these done within the time allowed. So we have good time for discussion. I want to reflect on, some of the comments from yesterday and even early today, really, which is a significant focus starting from Ponch's comments on use-inspired research. And there's really, kind of a long history of this. As people mentioned, some of the early founders of the field and early leaders were cognitive psychologists. I think that often surprises people. Newell, Simon, Licklider, Taylor all had their fingers in cog-sci and led the charge. And I think they would have liked this use-inspired focus. We also have kind of a history, actually, of bringing, diving into certain sub-disciplines in other fields, like, computer-aided design and EDA. There was a time when everybody added sort of a faculty member with that expertise, even though that wasn't really core computer science, into the faculty. We brought people, with typesetting expertise at one point, bioinformatics, additive manufacturing, machine vision, NLP, mechatronics for the robotics, security. My own field of networking, actually, I think of that as actually being about putting, compute storage and virtualization and information theory into networking and trying to sort of insert those in. So we have a lot of this use-inspired history, and we've, people talked about bringing anthropologists in. I think that's actually happened quite a bit in industry, not so much in academia. But Jeanette, you sort of took this to another level, and I guess it sounds like your president of Columbia is as well, because I think the knowledge to action goes further, right? Use-inspired sort of says, well, I look at the use, and that, that inspires my perhaps fundamental research. Knowledge to action is kind of different. I'm taking my fundamental knowledge and my results, and trying to do something with it. That may later inspire new types of research, but so the two can go together. So I guess what I'm curious about is you mentioned engineering has actually got a lot of use history and knowledge to action history. Med schools, law schools, journalism have all had this. We've had things like the DOE labs attached to universities, SCI at CMU, ISI, right? Is really a knowledge to action kind of operation. So, is this about getting more schools at more places engaged in knowledge to action? Are there whole new engagement models we're missing? What's the next big step that you imagine here?
Thanks for that question, David. And yes, I would say yes. Minimally, it is about getting other schools engaged in, supporting the whole idea of fourth purpose. I just wanted to echo what David said. Computer science and engineering has been doing use-inspired research for its lifetime. So that's why something like fourth purpose is actually not so novel to computer scientists or engineering, I should mention. And I don't want to belabor Pasteur's quadrant, but if you think about curiosity-driven research versus use-inspired research, I can tell you when I was at the National Science Foundation, we always put size and engineering in the use-inspired quadrant, and all the other basic sciences were in the curiosity-driven. And I would always argue, computer science is both. We're both, stop pigeonholing us. But in reality, we very much, as computer scientists, take our inspiration from solving real world problems, and we get our joy out of doing so. So you asked about, well, how do we spread forth purpose? It is very much about other disciplines getting on board and other universities getting on board. And let me just go back to something really concrete, mundane, but in the realm of the question, what does higher education look like for the future? If fourth purpose really does count, then it's got to be included in your tenure and promotion criteria. Full stop. Or it's got to be included in the kinds of people you hire and the kind of faculty that you want to cultivate at the university. And by my saying something as simple, it's got to count in your promotion and tenure criteria. That means people who are writing letters for you or for a candidate have to understand that what you have brought in terms of knowledge to action is as important as some of the perhaps fundamental research you do, some of the papers you publish, the students you graduate, and so on. So this could be a potential sea change for academia, and Columbia is full out, but it does engage. It does mean other universities would have to participate.
Can I make a comment on that?
Well, actually, Moshe, I'd like you to, but just before you comment, I want you to include in that, you moved seamlessly between theory and then it's used for verification. So both make a comment, but also, some of your own personal experience.
So, my career has benefited tremendously from combining the two things, from being able to just to try to think about the underlying mathematical foundation of certain areas, but also pursue application. And I spent almost 20 years working with industry to do tech transfer. Now, I have to say that I did benefit tremendously professionally from that, but partly because I work with a company that was very much in favor of publishing. Because if you go and you say, I consulted for a company for, ABC Inc., but everything is protected under IP and trade secrets, and I cannot tell you what I did there, then it's very hard to think, okay, well, how do we evaluate it? So I would say for this to work, also, whenever I engage with company, I always tell them, we need to understand the value system of each other, because unless they are consistent, we're not going to be able to work together.
That's great. Oren, how do you interpret knowledge, to action within the context of both your own personal activities, but AI squared? I'll stop there and then I got a follow-up for you.
Sure. Well, a couple of comments. First of all, as Moshe alluded to, it is very different, right? Our mission is AI for the common good, and it is very different working with a pro-publication company as opposed to furthering trade secrets. As I was thinking about Jeanette's comments, I was completely inspired. Again, not surprising. I would love to see University of Washington, where I was an emeritus professor, and other places help there. I'm wondering, how far do you see this as going? So I was thinking about, it's one thing to have use-inspired computing and to solve real problems in a paper, but I'm reminded that the head of the blood bank in Seattle came to me and said, I need to build a model of our donors. We're short on blood. I need to build a predictive model of our donors so we can get more blood, sort of contact them appropriately at the right frequency, et cetera, et cetera. He said, I don't have the resources for it. Help. Now, this to me would be akin to clinical practice in the medical school if a grad student or postdoc or whomever sat down and built a model for them. So I'm curious, Jeanette, is the thought in Columbia to go all the way to, quote, service, where you're not necessarily building something even novel, right? It's a pure application of technology under, very specific constraints. But it's just like going to see a doctor at the UW Medical School, which some of us get to do.
Yeah, I think that the feeling is about impact on the community, including the example that you gave. One of the most recent examples at Columbia is we just won the New York City Pandemic Response Institute. And, to be honest, the money that the city gave us is not for research. It's actually for facilities, but it's to create a coordinating center for the entire city, all the boroughs. And this was pre-monkeypox, for knowing what we learned, knowing unfortunately what the city learned during the early days of COVID. And now there is, I would say, a fourth purpose institute that is working deeply with community organizations based on what we learned during the pandemic. Everything from, the core research that gave us our viruses and also gave us better predictive models in terms of the numbers that we were all collecting in terms of infection rates and so on. And then, of course, the whole vaccination education issue that has to happen, especially in a very diverse environment like New York City. So that's just an example. And yes, Columbia's taking this quite seriously. Also, we're not just looking at local communities, but we're looking at global communities. So the person who's in charge of Columbia World Projects is actually quite famous for the work she did in Africa on AIDS. And so that's just another example of really taking knowledge to action.
Right.
And it's all about impact. It's all about impact beyond publications.
So I just wanted to add, and then David would go to you. So more power to you. I think that this sort of change will require a lot more than even changing the tenure process, which of course is very enshrined. Because academia, I know I'm preaching to the choir, so I'm more sharing this with the audience. Academia does tend to have this kind of haughty, for lack of word, attitude of, the papers that we write are so sanctified, right? And this stuff that you're doing, that's just, glorified plumbing. So I do think it'll require, again, not to throw away the valuable papers. Of course, I think you very appropriately put it as a fourth purpose, but to have that fourth purpose be a first-class citizen is a revolution on campus.
Janet, ILA has this lab or center at CMU. It is also about kind of trying to benefit the community around CMU. And he told me they had to deal with the same tenure promotion, tenure issue there as well.
Well, I must say, as people probably in the audience know, I used to be at Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon was very forward-looking early on because they had what I would call a fourth purpose track in the School of Computer Science. So there's tenure track faculty, there's research track faculty, there's instructor or teaching track faculty, but they invented a fourth track. And David, you would like the name of this. They called it systems faculty. People who actually build systems, people who actually build systems that work and do something useful. I call these the robot builders because, as you know, funding research in robotics, like what DARPA did, it's, demos for robotics don't usually work. So getting a robot to actually work is a big deal. And so we had a lot of systems faculty, or Carnegie Mellon had a lot of systems faculty who were in robotics and big systems builders. That was before the turn of the century. That's how forward thinking they were.
So I'm going to actually interrupt my planned flow to, based on a question that came up in the chat. Oren used a term, it wasn't quite public good, but Moshe you did use the term public good, and we've had a question of, so for each of you, the two of you in particular, how would you define public good? Really brief, and we got to get this brief.
I would say very simply, it's usually as distinct from the profit motive, right? So companies appropriately need to make a buck, need to earn a return for their shareholders. A lot of discussion about how they should do more than that. When we open source software, when we put the data out there, when we publish a paper that's freely available, in all those cases, it's for everybody. And I would just add another point. There are actually two pieces. So that's kind of the common, we call it AI for the common good or the public good, right? That's the common or public piece. The good part is actually very interesting. So for example, at AI2, we don't use personally identifying information. We don't work on targeted advertising, et cetera. So we also very much focus on the question, is this good? With the caveat that we believe that basic research in AI is good. And as Moshe alluded to, that's no longer an assumption that you can safely make about everybody.
Yeah, that sets you up, Moshe.
You know, there are certain things that we all agree on, but if you are asked to give precise, incisive definitions, we're going to argue about, okay? You know, we all think that good is better than evil, okay? But let's try to define even this basic term, good and evil. And partly what happens in the political domain, that even people who agree with the public good, there is legitimate debate, you know, what is something to do in the public good, okay? And people have to agree to disagree. There's a spectrum of opinion. We're not going to be always agree on what is ethical and what is moral and what is good. But you know, if you agree, the key on something is to what diplomats call constructive ambiguity. Let's agree that this is the guiding principle. And then certain positions will become clear that it's not contributing to the public good. I think we all would agree that the deepening polarization is not good for our society, okay? I mean, think about it. You know, the Constitution starts with the people in order to form a more perfect union, okay? Perfect union is not defined. What is a perfect union? It's not defined. But once you establish the goal, it's a vague principle that we can all adhere to. Now we can argue about, you know, is gerrymandering contributing to the perfect union or not? Okay, now it's a debate, okay? And so I think we can narrow it down to say, give me a special computer scientist. They want an algorithm, they want a recipe. What is exactly the public good? That's partly what we have to engage. You know, we talk about engaging from outside our box to engage. We need to engage with people who understand better societal impact, who have screwed up royally in understanding how our technology will affect society. There are philosophers, you know, who talk about the common good. I don't even know, if you ask me, is there a difference between the common good and the public good? Honestly, I don't know the difference, but I'm happy to be educated on that. So let's not get bug in definition. Let's agree that we want to benefit society. We are all members of society, you know, united we stand. Let's figure out how we continue, the sentence that is a guardian principle of the United States in order to form a more perfect union.
So Moshe, you know, in your 10 minutes, you called out free market capitalism as a driving factor. And you know, more broadly neoliberalism, and you know that explains some things, including you know somehow deliberately designing algorithms you know that would leverage the chemical processes of addiction in order to you know increase engagement. Right now, that you know on the surface doesn't seem like a very worthy thing to be doing. I can understand how you know free market capitalism leads to it. But I also didn't see the CS deans calling people out for doing that. And that one's related to free market capitalism, but there are other failings within our community. The other day, people mentioned, you know, run fast and break things. Sounds good until you think about it, right? Test in production. Sounds good until you stop and think about it. I love blockchain, but proof of work, come on, that's immoral, right? That's proof of energy wasted. Right, that just seems like it should have obviously been wrong. I worry about our infatuation with DNNs and you know the sort of exploding numbers and the impact there. And I just can't help but think that someday we're going to wake up and find out that a bunch of that was a huge diversion. So I guess where I'm going is, to what extent, is it incumbent on us to, to be, on one side of this or the other? Can we be on the empire side? Can we be on the, do we have to be on the rebel side? Can we be the clone makers that just basically say, hey, we supply the technology and we don't think about too much about what people do? The other day, there was the comment from Jurassic Park saying, your scientists were so preoccupied with whatever they could do, they didn't stop to think if they should. Having said that, Andy Grove used to say that in technology, whatever can be done will be done. And you just got to face that. So I'm curious where each of you come down, which is, to what extent is it incumbent on us to ask if we should? And does that actually, if we're not careful, conflict with research freedom and academic freedom, where we're then telling people what they shouldn't do? So just, kind of curious on your views on that.
We are not the first people to wrestle with this, okay? My car can drive 100 miles per hour on a good freeway, okay, on a good highway. I can drive that fast. In Germany, you can go, there's no speed limit, but here there is a speed limit. So when you talk to economists, they will tell you that the problem with the reason that market fundamentalism, which is a term coined by some economists, the problem with this, there are always market externalities, risk asymmetry, information asymmetry, and they say that how to navigate it. It's a difficult question. You have to find a balance. You have to decide. You have to look at the incentive structure, and ask yourself, do we have the right economic incentive and disincentive? Right now, for example, clearly when it comes to carbon emission, we don't have the right incentive and disincentives. You make money by putting carbon in the atmosphere. Come on, surely we're crazy. It's not the goals are crazy. We're crazy that we allow something like that. Okay. And the market is not some God-given thing. It's a set of mechanism developed by society. We decided the corporations have limited liability. Why? Well, it made sense at some point. I'm not expert enough, but at some point we made sense to limit the liability of shareholders to the value of their investment, okay? It's a societal decision. So we can change first of all, the terms under which capitalism works. And what we've done with automobiles, we're all addicted to automobiles, but automobiles kill people. And so we have spent now 100 years trying to deal with it. What do we do? We have speed limit and we mandatory safety belts and mandatory airbags. And we've done a lot of things. We said, okay, let's play with it. Let's have some government regulation in order to steer the market in the right direction. So we need to have a nuanced conversation about this. It's not going to be one or another. It's not free market or communism. It has to be a nuanced conversation.
Okay, fair enough, but I haven't seen the dean standing up for this per se. Jeanette?
We are muted.
First of all, Moshe, I haven't driven a car since I moved to New York City. And I do miss my Miata, but I'm clearly not addicted. I wanted to get to the point.
You don't live in Houston.
What was that? Oh, yeah. I wanted to get to the point that David was raising about the CS deans and so on. I think this is a sign of maturity of our field. And Moshe was hinting at, this is the first, if you will, scientific discipline to grapple with these ethical issues. Physicists, biologists, and now it's computer scientists. The good news is that we are grappling with these issues. We are having these discussions, and thank you, Moshe, for raising it in such a black and white situation. And I think that it's taken some time for our field to get to that point where we don't just go gaga over the technology we build, but we start thinking about the societal consequences of the uses of this technology. That's not to say we say you can't do this or you can't do that, or you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that. It's really to get us to think about what these consequences are. And then we make decisions on our own, just like physicists do and biologists do. And of course, there are organizations around those fields, concerned scientists and so on, that do serve as sounding boards, to put it politely, or, overseers of our own ethical and moral values. So I think AI technology has really forced us to have these discussions in a deep and serious way. So that's a good thing.
But we're at the level where we've started doing this, but we are still not very comfortable with doing this. Just to tell you.
Back to the CS Dean question, David.
Yeah.
I think depending on what departments and schools of computer science you talk to, there is now much more serious, sincere embracing of inculcating ethics into the curriculum.
So,
I would not have guessed this 10 or 15 years ago. I remember at NSF, we were talking about ethics in computing, and it was not taken as seriously and sincerely as it is now being taken in schools and departments of computer science.
so Jeanette, that's good, but it's looking in, right? I don't hear them calling out industry and saying, hey, this is not okay.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would speak to this partnerships in AI that Eric Horvitz helped spearhead, where it really was motivated about some of the societal and ethical concerns of AI technology. And it's quite a large set of partners right now. And I think it's an example of how industry itself recognizes issues and understands that it has to have best practices and so on. So maybe you're talking about there isn't the conversation between academia and industry, but I think those are happening.
I want to let Oren in here, but I would interpret that as monetizing the bad behavior of industry instead of calling it out. But Oren, over to you.
Yeah, so I think I have a pretty extreme point of view on this that might not be popular, but at least will contribute to having a lively panel. To me, there's a huge difference between virtue signaling, which is what a lot of this about, and actual virtue. So sure, we should put ethics in the curriculum and then we feel good. But do people really become more ethical if they study ethics? I don't know, right? The issues are extremely complex. So if you work at Google and you fight against your resources being used in the military, then you feel good, right? Virtue signaling. But in the scheme of things, does it matter? Because then the military will just go to somewhere else. Is it even bad that our military has capabilities that, when we see ourselves arrayed against China, against Russia, it's just too simplistic to take technologies, take facial recognition. It's very fashionable to be against facial recognition. And of course, it's a flawed technology, right? It's done badly with people of color, et cetera, et cetera. But if we call out facial recognition, is that going to make any difference to the way that China is using it to, for surveillance of ethnic minorities? I just think that even if we got the deans to stand up and issue, amazingly, a joint statement calling out industry, then they would feel good, right? But would it do anything? I don't think so.
Spoken like Andy Grove. Moshe, really briefly, because we need to move to other topics.
So just final thing was I've tried to take ACM who put it on the code of ethics, computing for the public good. I've tried to get ACM to put some, not to say this is a responsibility of the member, to take it as their own responsibility. And, let's be very honest. The industry right now is strong, powerful, and immensely rich. It's not so easy to pick up on such powerful and rich industry. It's okay. Matthew says you cannot worship both God and Mammon. Okay. I would rephrase it, you have to choose sometimes between money and ethics. They're not always consistent. They're not necessarily inconsistent, but are not always consistent. And it's a difficult conversation that we are not having enough, in my opinion.
Okay, so let's move to another topic. We're supposed to talk about new models for research and funding. Bob Kahn, the former dean at UCSD, often refers to philanthropy as America's hidden advantage. Oren, you're sort of experiencing some of that. What are your thoughts on sort of philanthropy, enabled and driven research?
Having experienced it firsthand, I do think that when you have visionary billionaires, and I would definitely count the late Paul Allen there and Bill Gates and so on, it is a tremendous opportunity. Now, I think it was Warren Buffett or somebody said, I'm better at allocating my dollars for the good of society than the tax system. And I'm not sure that I buy that. But given the fact that the tax system before the turn of the century, for centuries, has been unfair, the reality is that people make a killing. And then when they do spend that, instead of on yachts and lavish parties or what have you, they spend that to support research and to support the common good. It's fantastic. So I think that approach has huge advantages. So for example, longevity, right? AI2 has been around for 9 years. It's going to be around for decades more. It allows us to tackle problems in a way that's very different than how they're tackled at universities, right? Different cycle times, different, with funding and with PhD students and so on. So to end this concisely, we need more research philanthropy.
I'm seeing some head nods there. I'm going to move through a series of these, so we won't be able to have everybody respond to each, but prizes. So this is another model.
Can I just add one point about philanthropy?
Only briefly.
Okay, there are some things that foundations and philanthropists will fund that the government and industry will not. And I'm speaking specifically about software engineers and technical staff, which NSF usually will not fund, even research scientists. And so this is a huge benefit for the research enterprise. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is being able to staff up a larger effort, right, than just sort of faculty and 3 grad students. And that's an interesting discussion. It is something in the early days of our field that DARPA did extensively, and it made a big difference. I wanted to get to prizes because I really have mixed views here. One of the most successful prize efforts was when DARPA did its autonomous vehicle challenge. And from my perspective, I actually thought it was done initially, I'm going to say cynically. It was actually, we'll wind down a bunch of our funding to research in this space, but we'll set up this prize thing and get a lot of PR out of that. And it kind of masked the wind down of funding. Now, I'm not sure that was exactly the logic, but that's how it felt. But it worked, right? It created a huge burst of interest and activity and, accelerated things. So I personally am not sure why I bought them out. What do you do each, if you have opinions, what are your thoughts on prize, funding as a mechanism?
As many things, the answer would be, it depends, okay? So you kind of have to, so I'm looking not at big prizes, but they are now quite common in many areas of formal methods, for example, to have competitions. These are small prizes, usually not even money. You get a plaque, maybe. If they have enough money, get you a plaque, otherwise you get a piece of paper. But you get a little credit for that. And it's a huge motivator for people. And they like to be able, especially for students, they would like to be able to say, okay, I entered this competition, I won first, second, third prize, and it does drive innovation. But at the same time, it drives certain kind of innovation. So what you see in this competition, it's how do you compete? It's performance. It's about performance. So that's what drives them. And if you want to push the students towards doing a little deeper work, a bit more fundamental, may not necessarily lead to I will be able to compete better next time. They're saying, but what about the competition? So if you're raising children, you realize that everything you do has both sides, okay? How much independence to give them, how much to protect them. The answer is it depends, and we should not depend just on one mechanism, and we should be very sober at looking what is the impact of the details of the mechanism on what incentive does it create, and what does it discourage at the same time? Because if people do one thing, they're not going to do something else.
And there's definitely these, as you said, many sort of small prize competitions, but it kind of gets people excited and active and competitive juices flowing. Jeff Alstadt's actually suggested, turning everything on its ear. Instead of kind of rewarding people that write proposals, you actually, all the funding flow through bounties. And in fact, you use kind of crowdsource evaluation to figure out, which are the most important things to do. You stop having people, sort of working at funding agencies figuring this out, and kind of that would really turn things on its edge. I'm not supporting this particularly. I'm just trying to, see. Can you imagine a world like that? And definitely, Moshe, we'd be leaving certain things behind. But Jeanette?
Well, I'm going to say the very obvious, which is you need a diversity of mechanisms to fund innovation. Everything from the usual funding agency and all the way to big prizes. People are motivated in different ways. So let's touch on all those different ways to incentivize people to innovate.
And that one resonates with me. I always used to say when I was at DARPA that what people forgot is that DARPA rarely was the initiator of the good idea, right? The actual good idea probably came out of some NSF funded research or some industry research. What DARPA was good at was the amplification step, shining the bright light on it after somebody had done the first work. So the combo mechanisms worked well for us. Oren, any comments on this topic?
Well, I think the one observation I would add for this crowdfunding mechanism is that if you do too much of that, and I think Moshe and Janet would agree, then you have a rich get richer phenomenon, right? If you won the last bounty, if you're at Stanford or what have you, you're well positioned to compete for the next one. But if you're somewhere else, you may need the funding up front to build up your effort. So I think it needs to be done judiciously, and there's really important room for funding it. And where I would focus is on less of a popularity contest and less of a bounty, for performance contest, and more on the fundamental questions. So if I could just add one word, look at the challenge of common sense in AI. A huge grand challenge that goes back to the late 50s and 60s and McCarthy. Who's worked on this? Basically, Doug Lennott, right, for decades, and his team, and now Yejin Choi and some others. But very, very few people are working on endowing computers with common sense, which arguably is a huge holy grail of AI. And it's because you can't have a common sense competition, right? It's amorphous, it's difficult, etc. So I would say what we need is less popular context and more long-term ambitious proposal funding.
And I think that perhaps relates to a question that Karen Solins had put up, which is, while the use inspired and the research to action is important, we also want to make sure that, we don't get a whole bunch, I don't know how to put it, we don't get a whole bunch of medium scale insights, but don't get any of the big insights and lose the mechanisms for furthering those. Something that I think was interesting was, the U of T experience with, deep neural networks, right? You had a few researchers go off and wandering in the desert for decades. And again, this isn't even an area I'm super fond of, but I have to respect, they wandered in there, for decades. They actually moved it forward tremendously in doing that. They had some really key insights, and then worked with industry to get that, amplification and translation. So, I think there's questions about, how do we get the best of these if we're doing more of the research to action? Jeanette?
I want to echo that, and I want to take you back before U of T, because when I was at CMU, Jeff Hinton was a colleague of mine, and he used to talk about, building a computer that looked like your brain. And we obviously did not take him very seriously, but he was very determined. He had a vision, and he stuck to it. And, 30 years later, it revolutionizes everything. And I would say back then, this is one of those ideas that you don't know that it's a good idea. In fact, people were laughing at him. And so this is one of those things, and even in our lifetime, David, we have seen how some small kooky idea ends up being transformative to everyone.
Yeah. But we have to be careful.
By the way, I think he had a hard time getting government funding for that.
But we have to be careful. Most ideas pursued by long researchers for 30 years and nobody else believing them are not going to be productive. Okay, this is like Einstein fell in third grade. So this does not mean everybody fell third grade would become Einstein. We have to be. It's an amazing story. I agree. It's an amazing story of fortitude and conviction, and which is, even if you look at journal citation, it is mentioned there explicitly. It's not just a technical contribution, but also the perseverance. But it doesn't mean it's not encouraging to everyone. If you have an idea and nobody else believes in it, pay no attention, just keep going. That's not necessarily good career advice.
So Moshe, kind of agree, perhaps Jeff Hinton's work is an outlier. However, I have always felt that there is a certain amount of virtue in the lack of resources in academia. And so, Jeanette, this is going a little bit against, whereas I actually really believe in your academic cloud model. And if we have time, I want to come back to this, computation and getting data. This is a point Oren raised, right? We got to get these things into the hands of researchers. But having said that, we have lots of examples, Moshe, that were sort of, let's say, medium term, right? Where, I would argue that things like risk, realistically, Hennessy and Patterson, there's no way you could pull together a team, even, with the funding that their respective institutions had, to build something that would compete with, an Intel scale CISC machine, right? So they invented risk, right? Because, amongst other things, it was not only, they not only found a, good chain of reasoning for it, but it was something that they could actually do, right, with the resources available. So they found another path. Berkeley now, right, networks of workstations, and the basis for how all the hyperscalers build their data centers today. Well, they didn't have great big supercomputers and the ability to actually do the stuff that IBM and, Sun and others were doing at that time. So they, figured out a different path. I think not quite the same, but Stallman's work on, free software and GNU, sort of really major changes. So I guess first off, it's a small number of people can make a big difference. Almost having that lack of resources can force you to find another path. So is there, that necessity being the mother of invention, is there virtue there?
So Hennessy Patterson, when they wrote the paper for the Turing Award, the Turing lecture, and they kind of tried to give an overview of development of like 50 years in computing architecture. And they kind of tried to give some rationale of how it evolved. And they said, well, it was an interaction between the ideas and the marketplace. And the answer is, they did not have any grand theory. It just, well, that's the way it worked out. That was really the answer at the end. That's the way it worked out. And we all want to look at life and try to come up with fundamental principles that will guide success. People ask for advice on career success. And I'm a big skeptic all of this, because you have just a complex system, a particular outcome, and then we're trying to explain why the outcome was what it was. And it's not clear that people that were involved in it always know why the outcome was the way it was. I could easily see that story of the Jeff Hinton story end up with the lonely old man who never had any good luck in any success in his life.
I want to pile in here because Moshe, of course, you're right? For every Hinton, there's 100 or 1,000 people who failed. But at the same time, I do think that what David is saying has some real virtue in what about less resources and about the 1 in 1,000 who does succeed with disproportionate impact, because we can think about the nature of the system that we're in. And so there are systems, let's say winner take all systems, And competitions like the autonomous ones are like that. Who came in 3rd or 5th in the autonomous vehicle competition? Nobody knows, nobody cares, So there are systems that promote that. And there are systems that promote the longer tail. NSF is a great example of this. The main themes like, the DNNs, are, mainly funded in NSF, but still there's some iconoclastic, disparate voices that I might disagree with, but I see real value in funding them. So I think in academia, we have to preserve the long tail. And when you think about long tail distributions, just, distribution is exactly the right model. There are different distributions. We can have normals, we can have exponentials, and I would advocate for fat tail distribution because that 1 in 1,000, as David said, will make a disproportionate impact, whether it's neural networks or proving Fermat's last theorem. So let's keep a few, crazy folks on tap. And I don't think you disagree.
So I completely agree with you. There is a beautiful paper by Livnat and Papadimitriou, Sex as an Algorithm. And they say, if you look from a computational thinking point of view, simulated annealing, which is just a sequence of mutation, is more efficient than genetic algorithms. So why does nature like this messy mechanism of genetic algorithms? And the answer is, it gives you more genetic diversity. And more genetic diversity result in a species is more resilient because it adapts to changes. So I think creating more diversity and not having a unique approach, having diversity of approaches, and it creates a more resilient, I think, research ecosystem. I completely agree with you.
And again, by the way, I'm not saying universities should be deliberately impoverished. I really believe we need to get the data in particular and computational capacity into the hands of the researchers. And so that because I actually think what's amazing to me is it's still the case to my mind that all the cool work is done by teams of 3 to 5 people, not teams of millions. And that the question is how to amplify those small teams. By giving them lots of computational resources and data. I wanted to take us back to this new models for research. That was, kind of part of it. I'm going to throw some others out. What can we learn from, say, the open source community in the DAO? So having talked about how small groups of people can do cool stuff, These are cases where larger groups are doing interesting stuff. I mean, is there something because the open source community it had its seeds in academia, but now it's gone off and it is actually really quite separate and has, really, I think, done some amazing things. Are there lessons we can bring back? Should it change how we do things? And I don't have an opinion here, actually. I'm just raising the question.
I mean, one of the things that neoliberalism tend to do is to worship competition. Somehow, the best, the survival of the fittest and competition. But actually, human being secret of survival is cooperation. And finding a way that makes it easier for people to cooperate is a good thing. And what we know is that it's harder for companies to cooperate. There is an enterprise issues. It's much easier for universities to cooperate because most of the time we've taken out the profit issue. And in fact, my one worry about is the more focus on the for purpose is raising IP barrier, okay? I mean, especially you want sometimes, there are institutions, you want to go on sabbatical. If I want to go on sabbatical MIT, Rice and MIT will have to sign an IP agreement. And that's not an easy thing. Both lawyers are just trying to get into the trenches on this one. So there's a whole question to me about, for example, the Bayh-Dole Amendment. Was it a good thing or a bad thing at the end of the day?
What was
the Bayh-Dole Amendment?
The which?
The Bayh-Dole Amendment.
which is
Basically,
leadership,
governments, how
right?
universities
Our community is a huge fan of open access, and the main argument is the public paid for it. The public should have free access to it. But suddenly this principle disappears when it comes to patents. No. Now we're going to make real money. So we want it to be free on small potatoes, relatively speaking. But when we can make lots of money, no, now we own it. So there is a whole other conversation about the issue of the fourth purpose and the public good and universities and IP that needs to be taken seriously also.
Yeah.
So,
And I'm sure you are the secret of it in your position, Janet.
Yeah. So David, I don't know
if
if
it
you
went down, is it
have
back?
do you have another set of models that you want to try out on us? I just wanted to say
I have one that I don't know what the model is, so this is an anti-model.
but maybe let me just say one very mundane thing about open source, which of course was hugely meaningful for the software engineering community that always cried, oh, we don't have access to big software, but now they do. But I think the other point I wanted to make is to go back to your question about foundations and philanthropy, because once these open source communities get very successful, it's actually very hard to sustain themselves. And again, programmers, technicians, and staff, technical staff. And foundations are actually quite supportive of sustaining these kinds of open source communities, especially when they are benefiting other scientific disciplines.
So that's really interesting.
Look what happened with edX. That's a morality tale. edX came as the anti-profit response to Coursera, and they end up selling themselves to Coursera. So I think sometimes we don't appreciate the need for ongoing investment for sustaining something. It's very difficult to do with NSF. They give you money to get something started. Then you're on your own for sustaining, and sustaining costs money. And we can complain about the profit motive, but profits are a fantastic way to sustain an organization. And if you don't have it, then you better have another way to sustain something.
And many companies do make actually significant both people resource and financial contributions to open source. I think something you've raised, Jeanette, that's interesting is in the long term, does it need a philanthropy and or public funding? Even more interesting, you've reminded me at the amplification that we get, right? Where, kind of students, researchers today just sort of are able to take advantage of all of that code base, right? There's just so much amplification we all get from sharing code and being able to focus on writing the new stuff. And it really is, a huge, when we think about being on the shoulders of giants, a lot of it is on the shoulders of open source. So interesting observation you've made there. The one that it's, as I said, is almost an anti-model I wanted to raise, and it's been on my mind. It's actually something that my wife, who's also a researcher, brought to my attention, and Dan Reed sort of raised it, which is, we really are, on the academic side, deeply rooted in the mentor model for graduate students and research. So for academic research, and this is a complete power imbalance, right? People are totally beholden on that, whether it's a PhD supervisor, the postdoc supervisor, the small number of people that are going to write those letters. Could you imagine a department basically, because I think the only way this could happen, change, is if a couple of leading departments, or at least one of the top departments, said, you know what, from now on, if you want our grad students, they're not going to get mentor-based letters. We're going to find out some other way of letting you know that these are, signaling to you that these are our top students. So if you want to, recruit our top students, we're just going to break away from that system. Is this conceivable? Is it a good idea? Or are we stuck with this? Because
what is the point of that?
Well, we can try and put sort of.
Isn't the point of having graduate students and postdocs to?
No. The point is the power imbalance between advisors and the mentors and mentee invites abuse.
It invites abuse and it goes on for a very, very long time.
Opportunity for abuse.
Okay. Let me just say that there's a whole movement afoot in this country, perhaps started at Harvard and Columbia, where graduate students are now unionizing. And Columbia went through months and months of negotiation with the graduate student union to make sure that whatever bullying, harassing, and abuse you're talking about gets addressed. And MIT just created a graduate student union. So this is part of the societal changes that are happening. I don't know if this is addressing your question, David, but this may be.
I guess what I'm saying, Jeanette, is suppose we try all that and it doesn't work because fundamentally we've perhaps created a system where the power imbalance is so deep that trying to say what people shouldn't do isn't going to work. You will still get hidden abuse. And perhaps, can we conceive of an alternative way of, sort of, in some sense, imparting research skills to the next generation?
Let me flip that and say that I just had dinner with my PhD thesis advisor last Thursday. I still look up John Guttak, and also I had dinner with Barbara Liskov, her husband. I still look up to them as if I was just a graduate student. I so was, admire them. I have an incredibly strong relationship with my PhD advisor, and so you can have good advisors too.
Absolutely, and I did. And by the way, when you did your sabbatical at MIT, and I got to watch you and John, having moved from being advisor, in your mind it was advisor advisee, in his mind it was peer to peer.
Yeah.
And it was a full peer relationship.
I forgot, we taught a course together.
But we're the ones that had the advisors.
So I like to be an
exceptions.
Goodness in people, and look, this is
Okay.
Okay.
maybe Moshe and Oren have a comment.
No, so
I
one
do,
is that
I do.
it would be good. We need to have some data. We need to have some data. Okay. As we turn out to focus very often, it's easy to focus on the negative and abuses. And there are, I have no doubt, there are. But I would like to, let's suppose we do a survey, because CRA, part of the Tolby survey, maybe start surveying graduate students, okay? And get some sense. Do we have, are we talking about something that happened? Let me say, if it happens in 1% of the cases, I would say we need better policing, okay? If it happens in 20% of the cases, I would say we need to rethink the system, okay? I don't know. I don't have a good sense, okay? I was very lucky to have that kind of relationship that Jeanette is talking about with my mentors, and I believe I'm working very hard to have the same kind of relationship with my mentees, okay? But it would be useful. I think actually in my department, once in a while, not systematically, unfortunately, to do a graduate student climate survey, which I think we need to do more often. And then it was follow up. Actually, we took like a neutral person who went and talked to all graduate students and says, how is the relationship was going? Part of the problem with this is not just the power imbalance, it's the opacity of the relationship. No one outside of the relationship very often knows what's going on in that relationship. And that's another invitation for abuse. So I would say is create structure that shine some light into it.
Yeah.
But trying to revise a system, this is a system of hundreds of years. I would be very careful not rush into another system before we fully understand what are the implications and the consequences or the complexities of another system.
Oren?
Well, I very much agree with Moshe. Transparency would make a huge difference, and there are many ways to achieve it. The one thing that goes with transparency is oversight, right? So when the results a survey or whatever are presented, who looks at them and what power do they have? But I think if you have transparency and oversight, then you can actually do away with some of these other changes that have tremendous cost, like unions. Again, I'm not saying in general, but unionized graduate students impose a lot of costs on the system. And likewise some of these other changes. So I think that the right change is transparency and oversight, not necessarily an attempt to turn the academic relationship on its head. The one cautionary note that I would make is I also had a wonderful relationship with my advisor, still do, Tom Mitchell, really a great mentor. But the dynamics are different actually outside of computer science, right? So if you have, you have so many choices in computer science, but if you're a history grad student or a literature grad student, it can be very problematic. And my understanding is there's a lot more abuse in those disciplines.
Even
Okay.
in my department, I see a difference between big system builders, where the graduate students are more of workers, so to speak. They build important part of the system, and the style of my research, where every students work on their own piece and it's independent. And I'm not trying to put together all the pieces into one big system. I just a decision that I made. And so the place in which they progress only affect themselves and their progress, and does not have impact on others. So even in one department, you see differences.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to switch to sort of lightning round time as we wrap it up here, getting the time notice. I want to say I'm just a huge optimist. I think other people, Eric Horvitz had this as well. We're still, I think, in the early stage of our field. It's not like all the cool things have been done. I think there's huge room for people to do new things. We're just starting to really connect the physical and virtual world. We're really just starting to get the machines talking to each other. I think we're just starting to move from, for decades, we were driven by, how do we each interact with a computer? And now it's about sort of, how do we get the computers proactively anticipating what we want? So instead of us waiting for them, they're kind of figuring out the answers to the questions we haven't even asked yet. I mean, we have so much opportunity going forward, and we've had talk in the past 2 days about, the science of the artificial. We don't have to worry about Moore's laws ending because we can build computation out of any number of different, mechanisms and processes, right? So I think we have tons of room going forward. What I'm curious about is you've each got things that you're passionate about today, but if you looked away from your current space, AI, data science, what are some of the new research visions in other parts of the field that really catch your imagination? A way to think about it is if you were a CS Dean and you were looking to recruit some kind of outlier faculty to lay the seeds for the next revolution, the next rebels, perhaps Moshe would say, where would you look? What's caught your attention? Just real brief answer.
Medicine.
So I think, go ahead, Janet.
I would say engineering life, so synthetic biology and molecular computing, and combination of substance biology being a computing substrate.
Yeah.
And then the second would be quantum. I don't know where it's going to go, but I have to say quantum because it's just another 5 years.
Moshe?
I think we've neglected HCI, but in the following way. We thought of HCI as human-computer interface. And I think we need to look at HCI as humanity-computer interface. We've focused very much on how to make it easier for humans and computers to interact. We've then neglected what is going to be the impact on humanity, the societal impact. And that does not really exist as a discipline. I think there is real opportunity here for computer science, together with people in the social sciences, maybe even the humanities, to look at this interaction between computing and humanity.
I think that's a great point with all of you, and great, opportunities. I have kind of another question, since we were supposed to also talk about research funding. We sort of talked about it in the context of models. But, you know, have you ever seen a really great actionable idea with a leader that was, you know, wanted to do it, that just died on the vine because of funding? You know, or, you know, I'll be honest, I haven't, but over to you. If you know, can you think of a case where, oh, that was, I've seen a lot of sort of so-so ideas not get funded, or even pretty good, but anything really great that we've failed to follow through on because of funding?
I have one simple idea, which is that, to me, the best predictors how someone will perform with a grant is what they have done over the past 5 years. And this obsession on the details of the proposal, and we all know by the time once we get funded, usually we shelf the proposal, we don't even look at it, we just go where research goes, research takes us. Now, you have to make people to get started, and that's really should depend, okay, come up with an idea, or someone that would come wants a big grant, okay? But I think much of the work that's the way it's a business, give us a proposal, you spend a lot of time on it, we spend a lot of people reviewing. I don't know that this is an effective mechanism. I have my doubts. I think we can make it much simpler. And
we're out of time, Moshe.
Yeah, okay. It's over. I'm done.
I'm getting the hook, but Janet or Oren, you know, I'm viewing this as optimism for folks, right? Should they worry about funding, or should they just get the idea out there?
I think you have a good idea. There are always different ways to get the idea supported. So I have had my share of big ideas turned down by standard funding agencies, but that doesn't mean I stop trying to promote my ideas. There are different ways to get your ideas out there.
Yeah.
I'm also ever the optimist, David.
So just really finally, in the Star Wars saga, Moshe, Darth Vader, you know, AKA Anakin Skywalker, redeems himself in the end. Are we going to be able to redeem ourselves?
If we focus on it, I think we need to take it seriously. I think if we focus on it, we acknowledge the problem, we think very hard what we can do about it, we regroup, we look at what we have done that worked well, we look at what we've done that didn't work well. I think we can redeem ourselves, but not by just chasing money. That's not going to be the way to redeem ourselves.
So thanks for a great session, folks. I think we'll wrap it up there.